Webb, and I'm excited to be joined here with Dr. Shelly Bhowmik, and we're here to talk about colorism and burnout. So as folks join the live, be sure to say hello in the chat just so we know that you're watching, that you're joining us. And of course, if you have questions that come up during our conversation, we'd love to have your questions as well. We want to start with introductions. So Dr. Bhowmik, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. So I am Dr. Shelly Bhowmik. I'm a preventive and lifestyle medicine physician based here in New York City. And I work with companies on essentially bringing well-being into their DEI strategy. Focus a lot on burnout, especially for women of color. And my work really is because of my own personal experiences with stress and burnout and mental health, which I know we'll get to in this live. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And so, for those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Sarah Webb, the founder of Colorism Healing. I do public speaking, professional trainings, corporate consulting with companies and institutions that want to advance their DEI missions, primarily through raising awareness, shifting attitudes, and taking action to dismantle colorism. So, I am focused on all things colorism, especially as it pertains to anti racist strategies. And yeah. So we've talked about colorism and burnout. We've mentioned those terms, but I also want to define them for folks and make sure everyone's on the same page. So I'll kind of start with the definition of colorism. It is the social system that marginalizes people with darker skin tones and affords greater advantages, greater privileges to people with lighter skin tones. And there are lots of nuances and intersections that fall under that umbrella, which we're going to unpack some of them today. But I'd like Dr. Bhowmik to kind of, share when we say burnout, what are we talking about?
Sure. So I'm going to give two definitions. One is the textbook definition, and then the other is my own. So I'll start with the textbook definition first. In 2019, the WHO defined burnout as an occupational syndrome. So something that occurs because of chronic workplace stress that's not well managed. And in particular, there are three main characteristics. So the first is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. The second is feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's work. You can also think of that as having increased mental distance from your work. And then the third is decreased professional efficacy. So again, it's burnout. It's an occupational syndrome caused by chronic workplace stress, and it has those three characteristics. That is the textbook definition. My personal definition is that burnout is when you act without intention, when you are reacting to situations instead of responding to situations. Showing up the way that you would want to show up under normal circumstances. So those are the definitions.
Thank you for those two definitions. They both make a lot of sense to me, and I think they actually really complement each other. And I think when you and I started talking originally, we realized that there was a lot of overlap or related issues under the two umbrellas that we focus on individually. And both of us are doing this work and are passionate about our work because of our personal experiences with both of these things. So let's start by kind of sharing why you care about this. Why do you care about burnout? And then I'll kind of share why I care about colorism. And based on our personal experiences, how do you see those two things being related?
Yeah, happy to. I'll start with why I'm working in burnout first, and then would love to hear about your work in colorism. And my own work. There's a tie to colorism as well, but I'll share that a little bit later. In terms of the burnout, though, I like you said, I do this work because of my own personal experiences. I have dealt with mental health issues on and off over the years, ever since my mom passed from cancer when I was in college. The beginning of 2020, though, so just before COVID really hit the US, I was in a pretty bad place. And the scary part was that I didn't realize it. On the surface, everything seemed fine. I was living in Midtown Manhattan. I had a corner office on Fifth Ave. Things were great. But, clearly they weren't. On the surface, it might have been fine, but I didn't realize how bad things were until a Friday evening rush hour, standing at the edge of the subway platform, thinking about pushing myself over that edge. Now, it was that was a pivotal moment for me. To step away from that edge was like a journey in and of itself. I was one of those individuals who was so thankful to go into lockdown at the start of the pandemic because I literally needed that time and that space to heal and to recover. But it was during that period of recovery that I came to realize the power of mindset. I truly believe mindset is medicine because it was such a life changing force for me to recognize the power of it and then to tap into the power of it. And so I started Platform Wellness because as a physician, I feel like it's my duty to make sure that I pass this message of mindset being medicine on to other people, especially to other women of color, because at the end of the day, I don't want them to end up at that same edge, that same extreme. So that is the why behind Platform Wellness and this work that I'm doing right now.
Well, first, thank you for sharing that story because I feel like it requires courage to share a story that's that personal and vulnerable. But I also believe in the power of our shared testimonies. And there's a lot that I relate to, but speaking directly to the question of why I am so passionate about colorism is it's something that I have always experienced, even before I have conscious recollection. And I talk a lot about the story that my mom told me. When I started talking about colorism, my mom revealed a situation to me that I didn't remember myself, but she said when I was about 5 years old, we were visiting some extended relatives and they were complimenting my older sister who's several shades lighter than I am, and they were saying, oh, she's beautiful, she's going to be a heartbreaker. And my mom overheard me whispering to myself, well, that's because she's light skinned. And for me to be able to articulate that at 5 just reveals how many times before that moment I had experienced it and perceived it, right? But I always struggled with it in silence. That was part of where the pain came from, is that I never was able to talk about it, or I didn't feel like I had an outlet. I didn't see other people validating or confirming or affirming my perspective or the reality I was feeling and the emotions I was feeling. And when I was teaching high school, I saw the same patterns amongst my students, my primarily African American students, and they were saying disparaging things about their own skin tone, about other people's skin tone. And that's what gave me the courage. That's what gave me the push to start talking publicly about it, was seeing that it wasn't just a personal problem with me and that it was indeed going to continue into future generations if no one did anything about it. And I also am passionate about it because it's so underaddressed, even amongst people who focus on diversity, who focus on inclusion and social justice. There are still many people, even within those spaces, that ignore and deny colorism. And so I feel that much more motivated to be a voice and to give solutions and awareness and strategies for this problem.
No, thank you so much for sharing your story. I just have to say what you just recounted in terms of being 5 years old and whispering that, mumbling that statement under your breath. I mean, just to think that a 5-year-old can come to that conclusion. I mean, I definitely relate because of my own experience, and I'm happy to share that in a moment. But it's just crazy to think about how our little brains, like as a child, how we put two and two together and then come up with these conclusions, and may not even realize it, until maybe later on in adulthood. But thank you for sharing that.
Yes, definitely. And so I also kind of want to talk about, from my perspective, why I think colorism is related to burnout. And I know you have your own thoughts. For me, the pervasive feeling, having grown up as a dark-skinned Black girl, one, just in terms of beauty standards, which is definitely not the end all be all of colorism, I know that. But as a girl, thinking, well, I'm not going to get any attention for being the quote unquote pretty girl. So I have to be the smart girl. I have to be the well behaved girl, or I have to be the high achieving girl. I have to be the fastest person in my PE class, or I have to be super funny and super witty and have to be talented and achieve, and I have to accomplish and do all these things. And that, because an issue like colorism can erode our sense of enoughness, our feelings and self-perceptions about, am I enough just as I am? A lot of times for me, it was well, I have to be better. I have to be more because the way I am, according to what the feedback I'm getting from society and the people around me, simply isn't enough. And I know that you can never fill that gap. You can never fill that hole, right? And so you're constantly on this hamster wheel of trying to achieve, trying to accomplish, and the emotional toll, right, is that you, even when you do have fortunate or quote unquote success, right, in life, it still is not satiating. It still does not satiate the rejection that you continue to feel. And I always talk about the cognitive dissonance between, seeing objectively or rationally, like, yes, you are great, like, you're amazing. And of course, anyone would be happy to work with you. Anyone would be happy to be in your network or your circles. But then getting the opposite message in the way people were responding to me, getting the opposite message in the way people were interacting with me, and the constant rejection or alienation that I was facing in all these different social settings and professional spaces. And I talked yesterday about I could sense that when I show up for a job interview, people are somewhat shocked, right? Or they get that sense like, oh, we weren't expecting someone named Sarah Webb to look like that, right? And I get this vibe, and it's the constant questioning too. Like, even that can be exhausting, right? Always having to wonder, is this about my color? Always having to wonder, is this about my hair texture, right? And whereas people who are in more advantaged positions or more privileged positions, they have the psychological ease of not having that to think about or consider that, right? They can chalk it up to, well, they're just having a bad day, or maybe they're just, moody, or they made the wrong choice. And there's not this constant psychological burden of wondering, like, is my skin tone playing a factor in this, or is my overall appearance playing a factor in the way I'm being treated in this moment? Because it's hard enough to endure the treatment, and then you layer on top of that the stress and the anxiety about why you're being treated that way. So those are some of my initial thoughts, and I know you have perspectives of your own on that.
I do. And I related to a lot of what you just said. Although I don't relate to the part about PE because I already knew I wasn't going to be the fastest person or the person who would climb up to the top of the rope. And I already knew that wasn't going to happen. But in everything else, yes. 102 on the social studies test, uh, best at the piano recital, all of that. Yeah, colorism for me, or I'll take a step back here. So I'm South Asian, and in our culture, as it is true for a lot of other cultures, light skin is favored over dark skin. And especially as a girl, you are literally worth less if you are a woman and have dark skin. So I absorbed this message early on in my childhood. I don't remember a specific moment when it crystallized for me, but I will say that from a very, very young age, probably 4 years old, I I believed that I wasn't enough. And it was because of the color of my skin. And I thought that because of my inadequacy, because of my skin color, I had to compensate for that. Like you said, you had to be the best at everything else because, well, you know what? At least that's in my control. And so that began the obsession with perfectionism. Like I have to be perfect at everything else because here's this one thing that I know I'm never going to be good enough for. And it was that perfectionism that really fueled the burnout. Like I kept pushing myself and ultimately literally pushed myself to that platform edge. And so for me, the game changer was when I realized that I could start to challenge this limiting belief of not being enough. I started to use turnarounds like what if, like, asking myself, okay, what if I am enough? What if I've always been enough? And I have to say, when I started asking myself those questions and started dismantling these limiting beliefs, I for my whole life, I felt like I was walking around with these glasses, with these lens that had a shader filter to them. And once I started untangling these limiting beliefs, all of a sudden that filter went away. And I felt like I was living my life, like living a totally new, different life. It was just remarkable how stark the change was. And so, it's yeah, this is I could go on. I'm gonna put a period right there. But that is, just a bit about my story, and how colorism, quite literally led to burnout for me in my case. So
Yeah, there's something you said about things that are within our control. And I agree. I feel like there's like we can't control the systems, the hierarchies, the social value systems that are in place. So a lot of times we feel like we have to contort ourselves in order to fit into that, right? And so there's this constant looking for what can I control? And so for some people, they resort to things like skin lightening or skin bleaching, right? Or, in our cases, we went to the behavioral route, right? Whereas instead of trying to change our appearance, we try to compensate with our behaviors and our performance and our, level of achievement. But there are a lot of people who see it as being in their control to maybe get a lighter skin tone or to, have plastic surgery and that sort of thing. And it's,
side note, I did try those and it didn't work. So I think that's why I defaulted to the behavioral. But yes, so,
yes,
no, I tried
right.
the creams. I tried the creams. Yeah.
And I think what you said to that in terms of the filters, this is a lot. I use the analogy of warped mirrors. And if anyone has ever looked into a funhouse mirror or like a concave, convex mirror, and it like stretches your body out or it like stretches it out really wide or like makes your face look like it's rippling and that sort of thing. I feel like that's what social norms and social beauty standards and these social hierarchies do to us as when we're looking at society, when we're looking at media, when we look at how we're treated around in our communities, within our families, those are like distorted reflections of us. But growing up as a child, you don't know any different. Those are the only mirrors you've ever had. And so to you, that's the reality of who you are. That's the reality of what you look like until one day or by happenstance, you start to realize it's a distortion, like you said, or in some cases you have the fortune to encounter an alternative mirror, right? And so for some people, a lot of times I talk about being visible in my work, and I'm sure it's similar for you, Dr. Bhowmik, when there are other people who identify with you, right? In terms of being your complexion or having your similar life experiences as you, and they see you and they're like, oh, maybe something else is possible for me, right? Like maybe my narrative doesn't have to be the truth. And so I think that pivot point where you start to realize, oh, this was a filter, or this was a distorted reflection, or this is an outright lie, right? I do think that that's a first step to healing and to recovering from that. And like the realization that something else is possible is in and of itself extremely healing and extremely cathartic, right? And I'm not sure like if there's well, actually, I do think there is, but it's hard to articulate because each case is different. But I do think there are strategic things people can do to encounter these alternative perspectives, to encounter these alternative lenses for who they are and the feedback that they're getting for themselves.
Absolutely. And I'm totally going to have to steal this distorted, funhouse mirror analogy. I love that because it's such an accurate description of what's going on. And you're right. Until you have the opportunity, you're blessed with the opportunity to see the reflection without the distortion. You
Yes.
don't you don't know any differently, because your reality is that distorted reflection of yourself. And it's just, it's just crazy. It's just crazy to think about.
Yes. So for anyone who's just tuning in, welcome. Dr. Bhowmik and I, Dr. Webb, are talking about the relationships between colorism and burnout, and we've talked about why we're passionate about these issues respectively, and some of the personal stories behind why we show up to do this work on a daily basis. And, I also kind of want to elaborate a little bit on some of the cultural nuances that we see. So you mentioned being South Asian, I'm African American. From your perspective, is there overlap, similarities, differences, unique nuances between either the histories of these things or the cultural context in terms of how colorism and or response to mental health and burnout show up for you as a South Asian woman?
Right, right. I can speak a bit to you know, the history in terms of South Asian culture, and I don't know if there are parallels perhaps to other cultures, but in South Asian culture, obviously we had this caste system. I mean, we kind of still do, and skin color played a large role as part of the caste system. So those who were of lower caste, they tended to have darker skin tones, and those who were of the higher castes, more privileged, they had lighter skin tones. And I am remembering this one. So I'm going to take you back to junior high. This was in the 90s, and everyone was getting highlights, and I really wanted to get highlights, and my mom would not let me. And I was just so sad, so devastated. And fast forward a few years, we were in India for a family trip, and I remember my mom saw somebody who was of a working class or lower caste in India, and she she was visibly, um, you know, she had this reaction to the person having lighter hair. She said something along the lines of, "Oh, lighter hair, that's not good. Like, it just looks so bad." And I realized in that moment, she equated that, those lighter streaks in the hair to being of a lower caste, of a lower class, because that meant you were, at least in India, it meant you were outside working, the sun was lightening your hair. That's kind of what that was getting at. And I was just kind of dumbfounded. I'm like, oh my God, she equates highlights with being less than, and being lesser in society. And that was the reason why I couldn't get them. That she was very adamant about me always having black hair, and only black hair. And it was just, so again, I don't know if that caste system in particular is prevalent in other cultures, but at least in South Asian culture, that played a big role as far as colorism goes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that the relationship to like other features that complement our skin tones, such as hair, whether it's the color of the hair, the length of the hair, the texture of the hair, I definitely relate to that dynamic. And I agree that just in hearing stories from other South Asian people about the caste system being something that's, not universal, right, in terms of the history of how colorism has played out. And so, in thinking about my experience as an African American and being a part of the African diaspora, and my relatives being on this continent because of the transatlantic slave trade and that sort of thing, a lot of how colorism has played out in the United States, particularly among African Americans, has to do with definitions of race, definitions of who is considered black, legally considered black in the United States, and for the purposes of capitalism and to suit the interest of slave owners, slave owning people, they decided that anyone who had just a little bit of African ancestry could be considered black, right? Because in order to be enslaved, you had to be legally classified as black. And so I think that approach or that framework for constructing racial identity, particularly constructing black identity, has created this wide array of people with a wide array of features who all identify as black in some way, and especially cross generationally, right? When you think about how genetics works and you look at, if you have 5 generations of people who have lived here and all of the, mixing and the marriages and the children that have come from that legacy and that lineage, we can have a family unit like my actual family with people who have the widest array of phenotypes and skin tones, right? I have biracial people in my family who have my exact skin tone, and I have monoracial people in my family who are many, many shades lighter than I am, right? And so it becomes this confusing thing for people sometimes. It's like, what is blackness? Who's identified as black? And so when I talk about colorism as a lens, when we're talking about racism and anti-racism, is that it's precisely because of that history of how race has been defined that we have to include the framework of colorism, because there is such a vast array of phenotypes of people who could identify as black, and yet within that context, within that category, there are vastly differential outcomes, vastly different life trajectories, vastly different accesses to resource, vastly different interpersonal dynamics at play, right? And so I think for a lot of us in the diaspora, especially in the United States, because their approach to defining race has been considered unique across the globe, and their approach to defining blackness, a lot of it had more to do with trying to decide who was white and who couldn't be white, right? And so they were really trying to say, oh, who can inherit wealth? Who can vote, right? And they were trying to keep that pool of people as small as possible. And so even like other immigrant communities, right? Like post-slavery, after the abolishment of slavery, other immigrant communities were coming in, and the US government, the powers that be, were still trying to figure out, like, shall we classify them as white people, or should we classify them as black people, or should they be a separate category altogether? And so the systems of racial categorization, I think, on the systemic level, on the legal level, on the judicial level, definitely has a slightly different trajectory than something like colorism, because there weren't like sanctions or like written documents or legal policies and procedures that focused on phenotype necessarily as much as the actual category or classification. But yeah, that's, I think, one unique feature of my background coming from the African American context.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was fortunate to take a trip to South Africa at the beginning of this year, and so was learning a little bit about the history there. And like you're saying, in terms of the classification historically, how it was done, it's interesting to see how it's differed by country. In South Africa, they, folks who were of Indian or South Asian descent and people who were black were put into one category. That whole group was considered colored, and so there were laws and regulations and rules that then went along with that classification. But it's just so interesting to learn more about the history, the ties to capitalism, and fast forward to the title for this talk. How does colorism relate to burnout, at work, in the workplace? We mentioned at the beginning of the conversation how we both felt this, we both just felt exhausted. We both felt so depleted because of all of the things that we were doing to try and fight against this ism. Um, and and so there's no wonder that folks, especially in the workplace, feel this burnout, because you're having to do, on top of your job and performing well and all of that, you have this other driving force that is just literally working you to the bone. And so again, yeah, it's no wonder that people are emotionally exhausted when they show up, when they go through those doors at work. So it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And one of the exhausting things about colorism, which is something we alluded to in the beginning as well, is that for so many people, they don't have the channels to address it, or they don't feel like they aren't aware of the channels that they have to address it. Whereas things like sexism or racism are in most workplaces and most workplace cultures and most conversations around equity and inclusion and that sort of thing, though there are certain issues, right, that are more easily recognizable to people, that are more legible to people. So if you make a complaint about racism, right, or sexism, I think most HR departments, most managers and supervisors, they kind of automatically get it, right? Other coworkers, they might automatically get it. But with colorism, there's an extra layer of doubt or like disbelief. It's like, oh, are you sure? Like, because so-and-so is also black, right? Or so-and-so is also South Asian, right? And they don't have that experience. And so you have to go even deeper sometimes to explain the reality that you're experiencing to make it legible to other people. And I know for me in my experience, that has been part of the exhaustion, that has been part of the burnout, is feeling like I didn't have the spaces and the opportunities for conversation and redress to talk about colorism specifically, right? Because even if we're talking about racism, a lot of times the lighter skinned Black people are privileged even in those spaces. And so still feeling marginalized, still feeling on the receiving end, right, of the oppressive forces, even when we're having conversations about equity and inclusion. And so that's for me a big part of the extra layer of exhaustion that I feel.
Yeah, and all of that, the caveat is that that colorism is the issue. Like a lot of times I think we don't even realize that's what's going on. We can't pinpoint the problem. And I know with burnout in particular, it's, people don't realize that they are at that level of burnout until it gets to be at an extreme. And so it's, detecting the distress, identifying the problem in a lot of cases is, the first hurdle that you have to get over, and then actually addressing the problem is the second and the third and the fourth. So
Yes, absolutely. And I also think too, because I'll often talk about how things that don't get measured don't get addressed. And so it's not just that there aren't conversations about colorism happening, but most forms of collecting data, like actual forms, but also other strategies and methods of collecting data to see what's going on with our employees, what's going on with our clients, what's going on with our customers. A lot of those tools and resources and systems and processes don't currently have a way to identify colorism as part of the pattern, right? And so a lot of times it's like invisible to us, and not having that conversation, but it can be invisible to the system as well, which I think is really unfortunate, in some cases tragic. But also thinking about how colorism, there's increasing research that talks about the physical toll that colorism has. I think most people are aware, like, oh yeah, it takes a toll on your mental health. But if people who deal with colorism also are showing signs of greater cardiovascular, disease, and greater like stress related disorders and pain related disorders. And so when we're thinking about the overall well-being of employees and wellness of our coworkers and colleagues and whoever, even the communities that we serve as a business or a corporation, we have to understand that their colorism is one of those factors, right? One of those damaging factors that we also have to be willing to address if we care about the well-being, overall well-being of our workforce and our collaborators and colleagues.
right, right. Yeah, you have to take a holistic view of well-being. It's, not just, or it's everything. It's the physical, it's the psychological, the social, the spiritual. All of those come together to, to form an individual's well-being. And so if any one of those elements is off in the slightest, you're going to have an employee or a workforce that's not well and not able to show up as their best selves at work. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
And so, again, anyone who's watching, thank you for tuning in. I don't see any questions well, I see some comments. Thank you, Aya, for joining us on LinkedIn. But if anyone else has a comment or question that they'd like to share, please do. I do want to ask you, Dr. Bhowmik, in terms of burnout and how leaders at a company are, people in professional spaces, whether that be conference organizers or just anyone working with people who might be on the verge of burnout or who have already experienced burnout, what's one, I think, strategic piece of advice that you might have for them in terms of how looking at the causes for burnout is an important aspect to solving it?
Right, right. My ultimate advice is mindset is medicine. But in terms of, a couple levels from that, I'll say, start having the conversations. Just open up the dialogue to these topics, because right now we're not talking a lot about these, especially in the workplace. And so, for leaders to be able to create these spaces where individuals, especially at a company, feel comfortable coming together as a collective and starting to address, unpack some of these issues, that in and of itself can be so, so healing. Just to start the conversation, to know that you're not alone. Because I think that's another part to this too. We tend to keep a lot of what we suffer with to ourselves, and we don't think that there are others that are having the same trouble that we are. When in fact, everybody has something that they're dealing with. And so just knowing that you're not alone, to be able to establish those connections with others, and then to lean on those others for support is really, really important.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think we can't underestimate the power of conversations. So many times I hear people say, oh, well, we have to do more than just talk about it. And that's technically true, but I don't think we should devalue talking in the process of saying that, right? Like, yes, of course we have to do more than just talk about it, but talking is so important too, right? In and of itself. And the talking does more than I think people realize, right? You don't get to the quote unquote action or solution without going through conversations and discussions and dialogues and talking first, right? And so related to that, I think, yes, in terms of colorism and my, big overarching advice for people seeking to address this in the workplace is definitely make sure that there's that level of awareness. Because I mentioned colorism can sometimes be an invisible force or an invisible issue in many spaces. And so starting to practice that awareness and saying, how can we start to see this issue and integrate it, incorporate it into our strategies overall, but also in particular for people trying to create racial equity specifically and racial justice specifically. My biggest main idea is that it's impossible to do that without a colorism framework, right? And so anyone who is out there believing in racial justice, believing in racial equity, there's just no getting around the need to incorporate colorism into your efforts and your strategies. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So before we go, we do have some. Oh, hi, Jaquina Reed on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us. We're just about to wrap up, I think, and so I want Dr. Bhowmik to kind of give some last parting words and tell people how to follow your work if they aren't already connected with you, and how to stay in touch. And then I'll share, and we'll sign off for now.
Yeah. Well, please connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just Shelly Bhowmik, or you see the spelling there in terms of how to get in touch. Yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I love being able to work with organizations on really brainstorming how to incorporate well-being, holistic well-being into their DEI strategy, and colorism in particular. I mean, it definitely plays a role in all this. As we discussed, it leads to, folks feeling unwell mentally, emotionally, physically, etc. It leads to the burnout, and so having that, keeping that in mind, having that be part of the strategy of an organization is really key. So yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn if you're interested in chatting more. So
Yeah. And I see Keena. Hey, Keena. We gotta, because I was looking at Aya and Keena, and I was like, oh, those would be great people to do LinkedIn Lives with as well. So I'm just putting that out there in the universe. Anyone in the LinkedIn chat currently is also, I think, worth having a conversation with on related topics and issues. And as far as where to find me, if you are at all curious about this colorism thing, definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. But I also do weekly live streams just by myself every week on colorism, and those happen on Mondays at noon. Aya is a regular who tunes in every week. But I also have a newsletter on corporate colorism specifically. And so for people who want the specific application on colorism, how it shows up in the workplace, and ideas for how to start to address it, you definitely want to subscribe to my corporate colorism newsletter here on LinkedIn. And if you're on YouTube, just subscribe and hit the notification bell for all of the upcoming videos and lives that I do there. All right. Okay, folks, thank you for joining us. If you were able to tune in live, if you're watching the recording or the replay, we also are grateful for your attention and your time to these very important topics that are often under addressed. And we'll see y'all next time. Take care.